Good evening, I'm Faye Kwan reporting from the Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre at the 47th ASEAN Summit. Our top stories for tonight: ASEAN calls for dialogue and aid access in the Myanmar crisis, and United Nations Secretary General says its Security Council is in need of reform. That and more coming up on AWANI International. ASEAN is ready to provide support for the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, but only under two conditions: an immediate ceasefire and full access for aid to reach all communities, regardless of ethnicity or political affiliation. Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim says this was conveyed to Myanmar's leader, while reaffirming that the 5-point consensus remains the key framework for resolving the crisis.
Number one, immediate ceasefire, stop the bombings. And secondly, that the humanitarian assistance, including our field hospital in the military field hospital in Myanmar, is given full access to all, irrespective of minorities or political persuasions. I must commend that then the Senior General Long Lai agreed with this. And for the last 1 year, you see some relative progress, although there have been complaints about some shootings, but certainly not in the scale that we used to see.
Speaking at the East Asia Summit, he said Malaysia had brought together 27 opposition groups, minority representatives and political parties from Myanmar for dialogue, part of efforts to engage all sides and restore peace and stability in the country.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on Myanmar's military to end what he described as deplorable violence. Speaking on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit, he said he does not expect the upcoming December elections to be free or fair. Guterres stressed the urgent need to boost humanitarian aid, halt the violence, and pave a path back to civilian rule with respect for constitutional governance. So far, ASEAN has not announced any decision on sending observers for the December 28 election, widely seen as a move to legitimize the junta. The United Nations Security Council faces issues of legitimacy and effectiveness, says Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He notes that the Council's composition no longer reflects the reality of today's world.
We have 3 European permanent members in the Security Council. We have France, UK and Russia. And we have 1 Asian member, no member from Latin America, no member from Africa. This shows that the Security Council doesn't correspond at all to the world of today. Second, there is a problem of effectiveness, and the main element that complicates the effectiveness is indeed the veto power. 2 of the countries, England and France, the UK and France, have presented the proposal to limit the veto power in a certain number of circumstances, and I think it would be very interesting if the members of the Council would seriously consider those proposals.
The United States Ambassador to Malaysia, Edgar D. Kagan, dismisses claims that the newly signed trade deal undermines Malaysia's economic sovereignty. He says the agreement respects Malaysia's right to make independent economic decisions and strengthens bilateral cooperation with the United States.
And so, we have been very clear over the years. There are issues on which we've disagreed, but I think that the agreement protects Malaysia's sovereignty by making clear that Malaysia is making a sovereign decision to look for a closer relationship with the United States.
Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has voiced strong support for Malaysia's aspiration to become a full member of the BRICS bloc. He describes Malaysia as a natural partner with shared values and growing economic potential. On December 24th last year, Malaysia was recognized as one of 13 nations officially added to BRICS, a bloc that collectively accounts for 1/5 of global trade as a partner country. Meanwhile, Lula also called on Brazilian businesses and government leaders to pursue trade and investment with Malaysia and other emerging markets. Trade between Brazil and Malaysia, as well as Indonesia, currently stands at $12 billion US. Stay with us for more updates coming your way right after the break.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada.
Welcome back. The 47th ASEAN Summit moves into day 2, and it's already shaping up to be a defining one, witnessing trade and ceasefire deals. What's the strategic message behind these moves, and what does it mean for Malaysia as chair? Astro AWANI correspondent Cynthia Ng unpacks this at the Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre.
Joining me on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit is Hafizi Razali. He is the CEO and founder of Strategic Council. Great to have you here, right here at KLCC. It has been quite a hectic few days, I would say. So let's start with that. We saw a ceasefire agreement. We had Trump visiting Asia for the very first time since he returned to office. And we also had a US-Malaysia trade deal finalized. Let's talk about your impressions on what has happened so far. Some are calling it a diplomatic win for Malaysia. Would you agree?
I would agree so, mainly because we are able to resolve and speak on various issues, be it regionally or globally. And of course, with the inclusivity that we practice, not only that Malaysia has strengthened relationships with our ASEAN member states, but also with our dialogue partners, Japan, South Korea, China, and continue to ensure that the bridge with the United States remains intact. But more importantly is to be collaborative in the sense that now we are also including the president of G20 South Africa, president of BRICS, Brazil, and we have also engaged the European Union quite extensively. So I think it has been a diplomatic win for sure. And the outcome of it, as we can see from the summit in the past few days, there are a lot of documents that have been agreed on that centers on not just trade and economic development, but also on other issues such as research and development, human capacity, some technical arrangements as well. So yeah, overall it has been a very good chairmanship for Malaysia, and the double-edged situation about that is how do you ensure that the chairmanship momentum is continued by the successor of Malaysia's chairmanship, which is the Philippines.
All right. I want to hone in on Trump's visit first, because this is of course the biggest highlight of ASEAN Summit. Do you see his visit to this part of the world is in some ways a renewed sense of U.S. engagement towards this region? And what stood out to you the most in terms of his tone and language when you saw Trump here?
Right. President Trump has been always objective in what he wants to achieve. And obviously, as part of the arrangement of him coming here as well is to oversee the peacemaking arrangement between Thailand and Cambodia. And now we have the KL Peace Accord, of which Malaysia was very instrumental in making sure that both parties actually speak to each other. But more strategically is for them to ensure that there is an understanding on what more can be done in terms of the US-ASEAN trade alignment. Because obviously now Trump would have his domestic need to be fulfilled as well, particularly in ensuring that the trade imbalances are resolved by the end of his presidency in near time. But more importantly is for Malaysia, we also had the opportunity to resolve some of the uncertainties on tariffs, particularly. And yesterday we saw the statement of which Malaysia has managed to ensure that its tariffs are not increased. 19% is still high compared to what we have had in the past years before Trump, but it's still a reduction from 24-25% that we have had, although there are still rooms for improvement for us to do more.
That, because where we saw that yes, 90% has been retained, but in that text that was released by the White House on the U.S.-Malaysia trade agreement, there were some languages that were quite, number one, a bit open-ended still, and if you look at some of the limitations, for instance, It includes Malaysia's pledge not to ban or restrict exports of critical minerals to the US. So just one of the highlights that stood out to me. So in your opinion, how do you see this? What are the biggest gains and where do you think we made some trade-offs?
Right. The biggest gain for Malaysia is to ensure that the tariffs are not increased beyond what we have seen, because we have seen precedences of President Trump increasing tariffs, such as what happened to Canada. That's one. Secondly is that we have managed to secure exclusions or exemptions for our strategic sectors, particularly for electronics as well as semiconductor. So that forms about maybe 15% of strategic exports to the US. So that's not tariff, zero rated. Although there are conversations on how difficult it will be to actually fulfill those requirements, but that's a different conversation altogether. But also more importantly is to ensure that Malaysia remains in the trust environment, trusted environment of the US, because by being an aligned partner of the US, essentially that means that we have been chosen to actually be participative in the supply chain of the US. And you mentioned about rare earth, so that's probably one of the highlights of which the US may take home as a victory, because they are trying to diversify the markets, but to diversify from only selected partners, and of which Malaysia is one of them. But of course, there are also concerns from the Malaysian side on what would happen for the companies who are not included as part of the exclusions, because the tariffs are going to be a hindrance for our products and services to be more competitive in the US market, for example. And the compliance requirements can be quite rigorous, especially for SMEs to match up to. So perhaps there should be more conversations at the industrial policy, national industrial policy, on what the Malaysian government can actually do more to ensure that those who are not benefited, those who have not benefited from this arrangement, can still remain on the winning side rather than losing.
US President Donald Trump says Washington and Beijing are close to sealing a trade deal ahead of his meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in South Korea. Speaking aboard Air Force One on his way to Japan from Malaysia, Trump added he could sign a final agreement on TikTok as early as Thursday.
As Trump met with world leaders in Kuala Lumpur, US and Chinese negotiators held talks on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit. The discussions produced a framework ahead of Trump's expected meeting with Xi Jinping on Thursday at the APEC summit. China's top trade negotiator Li Chenggang said a preliminary consensus was reached on export controls, fentanyl, and a possible trade truce. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added that Trump's threat of 100% tariffs is effectively off the table after what he called 2 productive days of meetings.
From rising energy demand to intensifying climate risks, Asia sits at the front lines of the global energy transition. With nations under pressure to secure cleaner and more stable power systems, Singapore is hosting regional and international leaders this week to map out the road ahead. Fana Sheikh reports from Singapore International Energy Week 2025.
Singapore International Energy Week SEW 2025 has just begun here at SANS Expo and Convention Centre, bringing together global energy leaders to tackle Asia's biggest challenge, securing clean, reliable and affordable power. Over the next few days, discussions will centre on regional integration, energy resilience and the technologies expected to drive the next decade.
We have a very diverse group of speakers, very senior leaders from across government, industry who are here at SEW to share various perspectives, whether it is about regional interconnectivity, about energy technologies, or about policy changes that are needed in order to facilitate this. A lot of the discussion that is both at the SEW Summit as well as some of the exhibition here is how do we develop a smart energy grid that combines integration of very diverse energy sources from traditional oil and gas to renewable energy. How do we combine that with energy storage systems to make sure that the grid is stable and the grid can always provide the right amount of power that consumers demand?
With ministers, industries and international bodies at the table, SEW 2025 is expected to produce new collaborations and clearer pathways for the region's energy transition. Reporting from Singapore, I'm Fana Sheikh. Stay tuned for more updates only on Astro AWANI.
That report wraps up AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Faye Kwan. Thank you for watching and good night.
I'm reporting from the ASEAN Summit here at KL Convention Centre, where Malaysia is in the spotlight as chair of the bloc. Now, joining me on the show is Datuk Professor Dr. Muhammad Faiz Abdullah, chairperson of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, better known as ISIS Malaysia. Prof. Faiz, thank you so much for taking time. I know it's been a very busy few days, running up and down and attending all the related events and summits happening concurrently, but there are a few that I wanted to focus on in our conversation today. Let's talk about the KL Peace Accord that was signed between Thailand and Cambodia, and I think this ASEAN Summit this time around is particularly special because we have these two countries who have had decades of border disputes and border conflicts, and sitting together at a table, signing a ceasefire agreement presided by our Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and the US President Donald Trump. Talk to me a little bit about why this was quite a special moment, and a little bit about the role of Washington and Kuala Lumpur in this peace accord.
Sure, yeah. You hit it right on the head there. It is a momentous occasion for two reasons. As you say, you are not looking at a conflict that erupted overnight or just recently. Yeah, it is long in the brewing. It could take any slightest incident to trigger that conflagration, and so it happened a couple of months ago. So even before we jump into talking about the peace deal, we have to go back to the initial stages when it happened and what were the immediate responses of ASEAN member states, and in this case, Malaysia being chair for ASEAN 2025. So the immediate thing that was done was Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Well, he sure knows how to work the phones, basically. Yeah, so it was a case of phone diplomacy, back and forth, various parties, the parties that were involved in the conflict, as well as other parties. All that came into a sort of a simmering pot. Yeah, it could either boil over or it could cool down. So what happens is that under this particular style of diplomacy, we managed to get the whole thing cinema, and the following day, we got the parties here to agree to a ceasefire. And I think it's important for people to differentiate between a peace deal and a ceasefire. I'm not being pedantic here, but it's important, and because people will say, why, in a week's time there was fighting again. That's why it was just called a ceasefire. You need certain excuses for one or the other party for things to start it all over again. But I think on balance, it was a pretty good ceasefire, which eventually, accumulated to the process where there's going to be a serious resolution to come to a peace deal. And as you mentioned, the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord that was signed, and will become historical was part of it. I have to mention also the fact that it was indeed significant that President Trump was also here.
Right.
And I would reckon it this way. Malaysia provided, through Anwar Ibrahim's leadership, a neutral place for ASEAN. Yeah, that is very important. Yeah, because you couldn't have it in any other place. and also geographically most proximate is Malaysia, and also politically the right one because we are the chair. In the case of the United States, they provided what I would say the economic muscle.
The pressure.
Yeah,
the
okay.
Pressure.
To be fair, it's a trade deal offer. And no trade deals unless, you know, the guns become silent. Basically, that's what it is. Sometimes you need pressure to get things going. Yeah. So basically, you have that balance.
So you used the term phone diplomacy, which I thought was quite interesting. You know, working the phones.
Yes.
This was really quite a test of Anwar Ibrahim's leadership and ASEAN's chairmanship. So when you think about the fact that Anwar Ibrahim had to resort to leader-to-leader intervention, what does that say to you about the weaknesses within ASEAN lacking the institutional capacity to deal with any conflict between its member states?
I don't think so. Respectfully, I don't think it's a weakness at all. As you know, there is a process and there's the outcome. Sometimes people tend to say, you know, they downplay the importance of process, but process is very important. Without the proper process, you can't get the outcome. But of course, it's not about going through the process, you know, round and round and not getting things out. But here you have the outcome, which is the peace deal. What happens is that when one talks about institutionalizing of the peace process,